In this series of conversations, we'll be discussing global food sustainability with guests who bring a deep understanding of the environmental and cultural challenges facing our society and creative ideas on how to address them. I'm Ash Sweeting.
There's lots of risk, say, even now in selling carbon credits when there's a whole bunch of different accreditations that disagree with each other. And you wonder, well, who does carry that risk? So to me, the whole thing is recording data empowers the farmer to be the owner of their own fate. So what's happening is that Agriwebb is becoming the world's largest ground truth database for carbon sequestration. The beef and lamb production, an industry that the UNFAO, I think, cites as responsible for about 10%, 13% of global greenhouse emissions, cannot just reduce its carbon footprint, but it can actually become net carbon negative. So we can leverage ag tech to turn one of our biggest social and ethical challenges into one of our greatest solutions. And to me, that's pretty cool. However, it does demand that the supermarkets and the retailers themselves step up to take responsibility through the supply chain.
Today we are joined by Justin Webb. In 2014, Justin co-founded Agriwebb to digitise livestock farm records. The company is now focused on how to work with their customer base and leverage their technology to address the impact of livestock on climate change. Okay, well, Justin, thank you for joining me today. Basically, the impact of livestock with climate change, I see that as an opportunity as well as a significant liability. You've got the fact that on one side, grazing animals can be used to sequester carbon in soils. You've also got the fact that livestock emit enteric methane, so they're actually producing greenhouse gases. What opportunities do you see in this space to make progress, and where are your areas of concern?
Well, firstly, Ash, thanks so much for having me on. This is a topic that I think is unquestionably central to all of us in agriculture and food production. I think that re-examining the sustainability and efficiency of our food production is frankly paramount and should be forefront to all of us that are trying to innovate this industry. From my perspective, with Agriwebb, Agriwebb's trusted partner of farmers and ranchers, and just as we've helped tens of thousands of farmers adopt digital tools to look after now more than 20 million head of livestock, of mainly cattle, we are now kind of working to develop sustainable approaches to reduce those carbon emissions. Agri users ultimately are seeking to measure their inventory, right? The grass that they grow, and they want to optimize that conversion of that grass into beef or lamb. And that way, and through that methodology, we are trying to drive efficiencies of production, resource allocation, and harvest the inputs of soil, water, and land. So if we consider the optimization of the interaction of animals with those resources, the improvement of fertility, the reduction of lamb and calf fatality, the improvement of feed conversion efficiency through animal husbandry, genetics, rotational grazing, natural selection, those are all massive improvements that can feed the future. I think the information that we as Agriwebb provide back to food producers offers a more detailed picture of their soil carbon levels, matching up the growth of that grass, that inventory, the health of the herds, the pastures, with the carbon sequestration enables those producers to create more resilient, more productive land with less synthetic input. The data also provides a digital paper trail that kind of makes it easier to target value-adding certifications, such as carbon neutral beef, or participate in carbon sequestration schemes. I think there are lots of statements out there. If 10% of the world's cows are engaged in regenerative grazing or ate seaweed, then it would have the effect of removing 100 million cars on the road. These tremendously tangible impacts, and I think rather than necessarily just vilify the industry that's producing natural protein and switch to other methodologies, which I'm sure we'll talk about further on today, I think we can leverage incremental compound gains from digital advice, fewer trips down driveways, greater feed conversion efficiencies, and more optimal carcass feedback loops. We not only change the amount of food we produce, we transform the sustainability of delivery. And I think the amazing thought here to finish on it is that beef and lamb production, an industry that the UNFAO I think cites as responsible for about 10%, 13% of global greenhouse emissions, cannot just reduce its carbon footprint, but it can actually become net carbon negative. So we can leverage ag tech to turn one of our biggest social and ethical challenges into one of our greatest solutions. And to me, that's pretty cool.
What are the concerns in that space?
Well, I think it comes down to a fair bit of debate, right? Farmers should know that capitalizing on the carbon opportunity will demand sort of accurate data and systematic reporting, and that effort will be compensated. And we're already seeing that, right, through carbon credit price double and double again over the past year. However, there's no kind of silver bullet just yet. The contention around soil testing methodologies, the frequency of testing, the location, the operational practices that exist on top of rotational grazing, all of that's in really hot debate. But what's not in debate is the need to record data on the block of dirt. So ground truthed information. And there's lots of sort of attempts to try and do this at scale remotely, i.e. from satellites or from drones or sensors, but actually understanding what's happening on ground and ground truthing it. So recording that soil testing and pasture growth rate, et cetera. So I guess the point I'm trying to drive at and where the caveat is, there's lots of risk, say, even now in selling carbon credits when there's a whole bunch of different accreditations that disagree with each other. And you wonder, well, who does carry that risk? It's probably not, say, the carbon project manufacturers or indeed the purchasers of the carbon credits. It probably comes back to the people that sold it, right, the farmers. And that to me is misplacing the risk, because you're trying to incentivize these producers to be engaged with offering their land for this carbon solution. You can't just lump them as well with the risk on something that they have absolutely no control over, i.e. what are the certificates of accreditation and what happens if the goalposts move. So to me, the whole thing is recording data empowers the farmer to be the owner of their own fate. When the dust settles and the new regulations come in, those farmers, those ranchers can service the opportunities that reward them with the highest prices or the least restrictions or the greatest opportunities. So look, in short, and admittedly, it's self-serving because obviously I'm looking and building at a company that that digitizes on-farm records, but I'm walking the walk at the same time. It's kind of my advice is to digitize, to ranchers to digitize their records, not only because it empowers the increase of production today, but it also unlocks all sorts of opportunities in the future and empowers them to make the decisions once this risk is taken out of all of the downstream reality of carbon credit and sales.
Thank you very much for that. That was awesome. One thing that comes to mind is that, as you mentioned, farmers are the ones who are taking the risk. They're taking the financial risk in terms of the efforts to collect this data, the risk in sharing it should it be misused. And you've also got the fact that the place where the greatest potential to capture that risk is customer facing. It's in the grocery stores or the supermarkets or the retail outlets. So you've got in some ways, it's a logistical issue where risk is captured and where it's valued is not the same place. And I guess the question is how it doesn't need to be shared equally, but it needs to be shared equitably enough so that everyone involved in that supply chain benefits and it's in everyone's best interests. Is there anything you can add to that or thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, Ash, I think it's a fascinating and clearly neither you nor I nor the two of us together are going to be able to solve this thing. But I think we can start to chip away at the edges, right? And one of the amazing transitions we've seen, particularly in pandemic, but as a result of the genuine commitment to environmental welfare of the consumer, is that consumers are walking into supermarkets and making decisions about their protein purchases. And let's just take a second to dig into that. Red meat, particularly the natural protein, red meat is the most valuable product to the retailer in the retail store. Not necessarily because of cost per kilogram or pound, but because it's what's called a basket filler. And that just means when you go and buy your leg of lamb or your steak, you're not just buying that piece of meat, you're also buying the potatoes and the carrots and the mint sauce and the ketchup and everything else that goes with it, right? So it's a basket filler. And when a millennial purchaser, to characterize it, walks in and she is making the decision about what to put in their basket, there's a bit of like, do I really want this leg of lamb or this T-bone with a side of guilt? And they make the decision and don't have that. Now, that's a really terrifying prospect for major retailers, supermarkets, Whole Foods, Walmart, Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Woolworths, and Coles around the world. They might not be admitting it yet, and there might be a lot of sort of photos, the adage of the past couple of decades of just photos of really happy farmers and happy animals isn't, call it, cutting the mustard anymore. So how do these retailers back up claims with then their assertions that say this meat is not only representative of animal welfare, i.e., the free range poultry and egg argument, but also environmental welfare? And how do we assert that? And how do we label it? And how do we represent it? Because it is fundamentally critical to how purchasers are making those decisions. So I think coming back to the only way you validate that label is by going right back to the paddock, the field, and calculating, measuring the movement, the growth, of the animal itself, of the antibiotic treatments, of the pasture growth rates, of the carbon sequestration or the recapture of the farts and burps from that ruminant animal back into the plant regrowth of the grass and the soil that the carbon gets fixed into, and all the microbiomes that exist in that soil. So being able to represent that picture that's happening in field on that label and say, again, to that millennial that is standing making that decision and saying, well, hang on, not only does this meat represent animal welfare, it's antibiotic free, it's free range, etc., but also it represents environmental welfare, such to the point that not only was this meat carbon neutral, but actually was carbon negative. And by encouraging this methodology of production, you are in fact offsetting your Instagram footprint. And by creating these carbon sinks that can be sold to Microsofts and Amazons and other cloud services. So I think that is something that is amazing. However, it does demand that the supermarkets and the retailers themselves step up to take responsibility through the supply chain. They have to be the ones that have been making, call it the thick end of the wedge of profitability, have to come back and start to pay for the software, the tools, the hardware on farm to be able to record that information and pass it right the way through the supply chain.
Completely agree that the two of us aren't going to solve this ourselves. And it's a very complex problem. And very much it comes down to, as you said, to consumers being able to make the right choices for the right reasons and having the right information to be informed and be able to make those choices. And I think, as you said, the younger consumers are certainly much more active in that space than people from older generations.
Well, millennials are not that young anymore. This is the fascinating thing, right? We're all reading enough about this. Is right now we are going through the greatest transfer of generational wealth ever in history, and that's inflation adjusted. And so millennials are now in control and increasingly becoming in control of unprecedented purchasing power. That's why fintech and wealth tech and et cetera are such popular spaces. Now, the spread of that into what happens at ag and ag tech and therefore the consumer disposable income commitments is fascinating. Not least, sorry to carry on with this.
No, go, please.
It's we haven't even touched on the idea of, well, hang on, we need to feed 10 billion people by 2050. It's something that's thrown out at every ag tech conference and every article, blah, blah, blah. What is it? Okay, but it's one thing to feed number of mouths. The concurrent increase with the increase at the same time of middle income, particularly of the wealth of that population increase. So those population increases to feed more mouths are coming from China and Indonesia and India and et cetera. And those countries are also experiencing unprecedented growth. So their middle wage income, their disposable income is greater. And what happens when you increase your disposable income off a very low level? The first thing one does is increase the protein intake in your diet. And so you're actually you're putting more strain on higher order protein delivery. Now come back to synthetic meat production, lab meats, impossible meats, et cetera, all of which I'm a big supporter of as an ancillary service benefit to the existing natural meat production. Because even the most optimistic projections from Sand Hill Road and Silicon Valley say that synthetic production covers about 10 to 20% of the existing protein demand today. Now you add in all of this growth coming from China, Indonesia, et cetera, 56% more food demanded, and then a greater proportion of that being higher order proteins. We just have to make the actual production of natural proteins vastly more ecologically efficient. And that to me is highly, highly critical. It couldn't be a more challenging issue to kind of our existence when we're looking at climate change.
I agree with that completely. But if you have if the lamb chop you go and buy from the supermarket comes from a group of triplets, then the emissions or the environmental input or impact of the mother is divided by 3. Whereas if it's a singleton, then it's essentially 1. And if it comes from a farm where the lambing percentage is below 1, if only 50% of the females get pregnant and have a lamb, then you're actually doubling, carrying each lamb is carrying the environmental footprint of 2 mothers. So, and I guess this comes back to what you're doing in terms of the accounting or collecting that data from the farm so that you'll actually be able to know what the history of that piece of food is and then give it a footprint that's actually accountable to it rather than something that's an industry average or something like that.
Well, you're dead right, Ash. And I mean, I'm sort of laughing because, on our own, you mentioned our own place down in Western Vic. I'd love to see all the ewes throwing triplets. I'd be very happy for the efficiency and not least for the profitability, the bottom line. I don't think this does circle back to something we talked about earlier, which is efficiency and sustainability need not be, and productivity need not be in tension with each other. We as primary producer would love to see greater proportion of triplets, and we've been aiming for that. Traveling to New Zealand, desperately trying to understand how their lambing rates and marking rates are so high, and what their operational protocols are in order to realize that. And typically, it's about operational attention to condition scores of keeping these animals well fed and rotated in the right way, such that they actually end up being more productive on a per unit basis. So, the concept there comes back to record the information so that you can identify which animals have a higher propensity to be efficient breeders, and then feed those ones more. Let those goose be the ones that lay your golden egg. And so, yes, from an Agriwebb perspective, of course, we're trying to encourage both our existing customers and our prospective ones and any progressive farmers to record their information to make more efficient, productive decisions. But then at the same time, we're trying to bring this ecosystem. We're not, Agriwebb certainly not going to be able to do this on its own. So all of these other innovations that contribute to efficiencies of production on farm, i.e., satellite pasture readers, the SIBO labs, the downforce, the DCAT, the regrow, being able to understand at scale what your pasture either potential or existing is, and being able to rotate accordingly, right the way through to the supply chain and making sure that with the predictions of when animals or natural protein or food will be ready at what time from what location. So you're reducing the footprint of trucks driving around and making sure that you have greater efficiency of the pickups, and making sure that when animals arrive at the processor, we move from an average of less than 50% of animals arriving in spec to closer to where pork is, which is sort of 99.5% in spec. And all of these efficiencies have a tremendous impact on feeding, a increasing population that is demanding greater protein and having a lower environmental footprint. So, let's all commit together to actually sharing the information and delivering it through to the consumer, and encouraging the retailer to be part of this conversation, both commercially as well as anecdotally.
So I'm gathering from what you're saying that you think it's much more of a systems approach. It's getting the right sensor systems, it's creating the right partnerships, the right collaboration across the value chain that is going to be more important in the final solution than any one particular technology, be that a feed additive or some other innovation. Is that where you see the answer in collaboration and partnership?
Yeah, look, I said earlier, there's no silver bullet. There's no single solution. And I think that is true. We're talking about a massive industry literally feeding the world. And so it's not surprising that there isn't a single, okay, I'll just implement that and all will be fine. And it's true right down to the consumer. Like the solution is not just to become vegan, because the growth of plant-based proteins has a huge ecological environmental footprint, not least by the plowing up of fields and destruction of biospheres in the fields that those natural proteins are created. So I think that coming back to the space that at least I'm working in and I'm looking at within the livestock industry and the red meat production, to empower the livestock industry with the best tools to feed the world sustainably, profitably, and efficiently. I mean, I couldn't think of a more motivating mission. It's perhaps the most critical consideration of our generation is this contemporaneous challenge of feeding a growing population with a rising demand for healthy, inexpensive, and universally available natural diet, while simultaneously reducing environmental impact. If we truly want to deliver on providing our food production industry with the best possible tools, then we need to be providing the same access. We collectively, all of us as innovators, need to be providing the industry with the same access to cutting edge, intuitive, insight-driven tech that's been already prioritized in other major business sectors for decades. And our industry in agriculture is taking on this Herculean task of feeding 2 billion more people in the next 30 years, and all while reducing the environmental footprint and giving visibility to governments, to retailers, to consumers. I think that the primary producers and the supply chain right the way through, retailers, suppliers, processors, deserve tools that are as smart and sophisticated and adaptive as they are. And I think it's our vision that it's not only Agriwebb that will bring these solutions to market, that allow farmers to own their future, but all the other innovators will join in this mission. And we hope that we can lead by example in this mission, and actively please invite others to join with us and become part of this, because the world came to its senses pretty dramatically over the past 2 years that farmers are the heroes of our society. When the pandemic strikes and global food chains sort of threaten food on the shelves, it was farmers, ranchers that kept us fed. And so therefore, our opportunity as innovators and technologists, let's call it, the opportunity for us to reward and empower that group of producers is fantastic, and it's pretty fulfilling.
It goes back, I guess, the warning. There's the analysis that when people go hungry, they do one of three things. They either fight, they move, or they fight. And that's something that's been fairly well established over millennia, not just over the last 2 years. Is there anything you can share on projects, programs, the current developments that Agriwebb's working on or about to implement in this space?
Look, I think that where Agriwebb is as we continue to drive the scale of our user base, across it's 125 million acres that's being managed on Agriwebb. And as I mentioned, sort of more than 20 million head of livestock. And what's happening is that as our ranchers and our farmers record information about their pastures, about their movements, their rotations, their animal growth, they are themselves becoming more efficient producers. But at the same time, they are recording passively the ground truth data on all of those 125 million acres. So what's happening is that Agriwebb is becoming the world's largest ground truth database for carbon sequestration and therefore ground truth for carbon offsets and supply chain insets and etc. That is a massive opportunity to reward and return our customers with the ability to further monetize their own operations. So that's something that is tremendously exciting for us, and something that very happy to announce in this space. The other is I've spent a bit of time in our chat, sort of a call to action to urge the retailer to take responsibility. We're seeing that. I mean, in the UK, several of the different retailers, but particularly Morrisons and Sainsbury's, both of whom stepped up to commit to having a net neutral supply chain by 2030. It's not that far away, and Morrisons in particular has signed up. They purchase licenses of Agriwebb, give it to their producers, and leverage the information of pasture growth rates offset against the emission from the animals that the cattle that are at certain stages of their life cycle, and work out the recapture of carbon from the amount of dry matter, kilogram dry matter per acre or hectare that's being grown. And so they are able to, rather than estimating or guesstimating the footprint and then buying forests in Norway, they're actually able to inset the carbon footprint of their supply chain, which is pretty cool. And we're seeing the same thing, more to do with genetics that we talked about with Sainsbury's and through ABP, leveraging Agriwebb to have a greater understanding of the carbon footprint and the readiness and the efficiency of their animals through an integrated supply chain. So, there are plenty of examples, particularly in Europe and in the United States, less so in Australia to this point, but we're really excited to encourage some of the best-in-class practices that are happening around the world and bring them back to Australia or across to the United States.
Do you think the greater competitiveness or competitive environment within the supermarket sector in the UK plays a role in that?
Well, there's a bit to unpack in that, but I think that, at its basic level, there's 65 million people to feed on a pretty small island that only produces about just over 55% of if its total food production could only feed about 55% of the population. So fundamentally, they have to be super efficient with their production. And so, there is a much greater collaboration between the retailers and their processors, retailers and their primary producers, the farmers, the ranchers, the producers of food from the ground. And so I think that's a forcing function for sure in the UK. Globally, I think it would be fair to say that the retailing world does look to Tesco's and Sainsbury's and those UK particularly, but UK and European supermarkets as being the leading innovators of food retailing. There's a reason why Woolworths and Coles hire people from Tesco and Sainsbury's by the metric ton, or why Walmart seeks to buy the supermarkets as a whole. So I think there's a lot to be learned, but there's equally a lot to be learned the other way. We've got some amazing export markets and export marketability that both we here in Australia and New Zealand have been able to achieve. So it's not all a one-way knowledge flow. I think that we can have a really productive exchange. Some free trade agreements that have just come in offer opportunity to do that.
Thank you very much, mate. Is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't already covered? We've covered a broad range of topics.
Well, I'd be astonished if anyone's still listening to mostly me when I gab on. We'd be one of those people in the corner of the pub that people kind of come over and be like, yeah, no, and head back to the other side. But look, thanks so much for having me on. Really excited to have the chat. And my call to action is that if anyone is listening to this and is inspired, intrigued by the mission that Agriwebb is on, we are hiring. We're looking for really good talent to come in and help drive our business forward, whether that's in Colorado in the US, in London in the UK, or in Sydney here. We'd love to hear from you. So please reach out to agriwebb.com and have a look at some of our job postings and come join the mission.
Cheers. Thanks, mate.
Thanks so much.